Welcome back. All right, so we've got a small but very no, I'm going to take these out. Sorry.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. A small but very aware and concerned and supportive audience. And so I'm going to introduce our speakers or introduce our panelists, but I'm hoping that because this is such a small group, once I, give the introductions and stuff, we can take this conversation wherever it takes us, because I'm sure with you two in the breakout room and us three out here, we were already having conversations and sharing stories from the trenches and just basically just asking for dignity, which, if you've ever felt that way, that's how you know you're in the right place. So I'll start by acknowledging that I'm grateful to live and work on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, OG Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of Métis Nation here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I'd also like to thank the conference organizers and all of you here today who, chose to spend your Saturday morning talking about something so painful. Right? It's a painful thing. It digs deep. Teaching during COVID has been stressful beyond measure. While avoiding a life-threatening pandemic, teachers are expected to gracefully adapt to our pedagogies, to unfamiliar technologies. These stressors are exacerbated by our isolation from comforting and supportive hallway chats with colleagues. However, there is one section of higher education teachers that is uniquely liable to fall through the tracks. And we here all know that is sectional instructors / adjuncts / precarious faculty, whatever you want to call them. The stress of pandemic precarity exacerbates pre-existing uncertainties that adjuncts face while trying to forge careers in higher education, right? So essentially, like begging for the privilege of being able to get a career in the area that we studied for, that we trained for, that we're so good at. The panel seeks to provide a platform from which adjuncts can shed light on their unique struggles of compounded precarity. Presented in a roundtable fashion, we will address issues such as how disproportionately hard adjuncts must fight to receive COVID teaching stipends, work from home support, contract extensions, and acknowledgement by full-time faculty members responsible for hiring fellow PhDs for poverty wages. Also, issues of literally being a human being in the world as the neoliberal / gig economy tries to treat us like disembodied brains, but we have families and we have bodies that need medications and dental work and bodies that need to be housed and time and energy. And these are just basic things that we need and deserve. But how often those efforts are erased, and partially because they are so uncomfortable that people who would ostensibly be having careers that support all forms of equity allow their own colleagues to call them underemployed is an insult, because it's not even underemployment, it's gig economy, and that's not okay. And these expectations of pivoting, well, maybe you could do this, well, maybe you could do this, if you could just be more flexible with your hopes and dreams, if you could be more flexible with where you live and where you're going to put your children in school, and whether you ever need to see your family again, or if you're willing to see your family again, will you ever be able to take a vacation, because you're literally spending all your money getting back to see your family. And so institutions rely on adjuncts' passion for teaching, but in doing so neglect to understand what this roundtable seeks to argue, that faculty working conditions are student learning conditions. Okay, so I'll start with introducing myself. I'm Dr. Erin Weinberg. I'm a new faculty member at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, where I teach a very substantial teaching load and all first-year English literature courses. I was hired to be a teacher. I am so happy to finally have full-time work after doing so much academic precarity that ultimately culminated in me teaching at 3 different universities in 3 different time zones during COVID. An act which literally gave my H&R Block accountant a panic attack, trying to organize all of that. And I really thought that these fights for equity, I still intended to fight for adjuncts once I had my full-time job, but the fight for equity continues in this 2-tier system at the University of Manitoba with instructors versus professors, and the idea that we're somehow doing less when that's really not the case, and we're all colleagues and need to treat each other with respect. Melissa, who's on the program, won't be here today for the exact reasons that we're talking about today. Melissa is an instructional designer at MacEwan University in Edmonton, and she's also an adjunct instructor at the University of Alberta, which she doesn't even want to tell her full-time employers about, but she still just wants to hold on to being a professor, that she's not willing to let that go, but it is taking a lot of emotional energy. And so that is why she's not able to be here today. Alex Wagstaff, pronouns they, them, is also not, I'm guessing they're not here because they live in BC and it might have just been too many time zones to figure out. They may be sleeping, but that's also because they're doing their comprehensive exam year of their PhD, which they're doing through McMaster University in Hamilton, while living across the country in Prince George, British Columbia, where they teach at, I think, 1 university and 1 community college. Alex and I met each other as precarious faculty members teaching literature, surveys, and composition in rural Brandon, Manitoba. And I was so grateful for their solidarity, because so ignored were we. So not just mistreated, but ignored were we by the department there, that we weren't even included on the faculty emails. And that was humiliating to me as a very accomplished scholar in and of myself. All right, Dr. Amy Scott, give us a wave, Amy. Her has a PhD in English, early modern literature from McGill University. After convocating, she taught writing and communication courses for several colleges in Ontario. She lives in Toronto, and as an independent scholar, and let's talk about the dreaded independent scholar, because we have to talk about it, is writing a monograph based on her dissertation while caring for 3 young children full-time. That's right. Caring for 3 children full-time while still trying to write her book without any institutional support, colleagues, university childcare, all of those things. And Alina Tepperman, her, is an American educator with 8 years of experience teaching high school English in Florida and South Carolina. And she immigrated to Canada during the pandemic and is in the process of updating her skill set for the Canadian job market. She holds an MA in English literature from Queen's University and an M.Ed in English education from the University of Florida. Go Gators. As a recent immigrant looking for full-time work as a teacher, Alina understands the frustrating demands of precarious underemployment in education, and also the drive to continuously get more and more qualifications to make sure that she is able to survive in a job market that she was already very well trained for, very well educated and trained for in the first place. So welcome. I was wondering if James and Jacob, if you could introduce yourselves. James, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I'm James Hoff. I'm an associate professor at BMCC in the English department. I chose this panel because, as I was saying earlier, I adjuncted for about 14 years, so I know what it's like. And I've been an adjunct activist for, probably the last, 12 years or so. So in my union, and it's, the two-tier system and the way it grinds people up and spits them out and treats them like, disposable labor, like a lot of jobs, unfortunately, is something that I really am concerned about. And so I'm really interested in hearing what folks have to say about their experiences.
Thank you. Jacob.
Hi, can you hear me? Jacob Bender. I'm a tenure track faculty at Middlesex College, two-year college in New Jersey. I also was an adjunct for about 5 years.
We're having a little trouble hearing you, Jacob. I think when your camera's on, it just kind of gets a little bit shaky.
How about now? All right, you don't need to see my ugly mug anyways. So, said I'm tenure track faculty at Middlesex College in New Jersey, but I was an adjunct for about 5 years. And if you include my time as a grad student, contingent faculty for about 8 years, and still something near and dear to my heart. My current college is in the middle of a labor action against our administration, not only because they haven't given us a pay raise in 2.5 years, we're working without contract, but they have made no moves to replace any of the tenure track faculty that retired or passed away during the pandemic. And so it's my union, at least to its credit, has been fighting for creating more full-time positions where adjuncts have more job mobility. And I was also involved in labor actions when I was a grad student at Iowa, where I was just talking about this with James. On one hand, we should all be in this together. On the other hand, I do distinctly remember full-time faculty at Iowa saying, well, maybe the grad students are asking too much. And it's like, we're less than 2% of the university's operating budget. Give me a break. And so I think there's an argument to be made that adjuncts and other contingent faculty should have their own union anyways, just because there's, someone finally gets tenure or a tenure track position and they forget. That's just a human condition. Anyways, I'm trying not to forget. And it is something I'm trying to, now that I'm at least nominally in a position of power, I'd like to advocate for more. But in any case, I'm trying to stay plugged in to that conversation.
Yeah, this is an important conversation in terms of equity, in terms of like intersectionality and saying, who is this disproportionately affecting, right? All of those things, there's so much to talk about. I'd love to start by talking about the notion of finishing graduate school. And whereas in a previous generation, finishing a degree would mean that you can just jump into a job, that is not always the case, and how it leads to a certain arrested development. Right? Amy, I know that you graduated several years ago. What year was it that you graduated?
That was 2010.
2010. And so, like, it's been a long time, and you have 3 children. Like, you have created a dissertation and 3 children. How do you feel like precarity is forcing you into this state of like arrested development?
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, the job market is really terrible now, but in 2010, it was already really terrible. And I think our field uses postdocs as that sort of bridging time. And in 2010, the postdocs were already such hugely competitive things that I did what you do, which is in Canada to apply for a SSHRC postdoc, a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council postdoc, which are wonderful. And you just do it, and it's not like I expected to get it, but I didn't expect to not get it like 3 times in a row, and with different projects trying to sort of fit, try out different things to see what would stick. And the problem for me was that I was in Toronto, and, the best postdoc application is one where you go to the place where there's the scholar that is working exactly what you're working on and has access to sort of archives that would be helpful in your studies. And for me, my last application, I was going to write about infertility on the early modern stage. And there's amazing scholars here in Toronto, but there was not really that person that was working on something. And so I felt like my application wasn't competitive enough in that respect. I almost got it. They recommended that I be funded, but then SSHRC said there wasn't enough money and to try again next year. And that leads me to my other point, which is you can only apply for these things for a limited amount of time after you get your PhD. So that was my last chance to apply to that. And I felt like that was the moment when I realized that I'd entered purgatory, and I still don't know a pathway out. And as I've had children, as time has gone on, the years sort of slip by, and this in a sort of teaching heavy job. Certainly when I was working for Humber College or Seneca College here in Toronto, the teaching expands to fill all possible space that you have. And so a lot of my work on my dissertation into the book just fell by the wayside. And I think it was an emotional thing for me too. The sort of rejection of the postdocs affected my confidence. That ever strong imposter syndrome reared its ugly head, and it's still with me. And then as you age, you start, and Elaine and I were talking about this, as you age, you start to feel like some sort of weird creature that is both early career and older than most of the people who are, associate professors or even getting tenure. So it's a really sort of strange place where you're negotiating your identity as a scholar, and there is no identity. And we can talk about that dreaded independent scholar title as well too. But that's generally my feeling, is like the postdoc was my hope. And, sort of that was the point where I entered this sort of no man's land.
Thank you. Thank you for starting us off. I want to pick up on what you said about this, try again next year thing, because it's like, okay, but what do you expect me to do now? Mm-hmm. And Alina, I know that you have spent a bunch of time acclimatizing to, a new city and trying to get your Canadian citizenship, and like this notion of purgatory. So what does one do in this purgatory to keep current, so as to not stop working, but at the same time, perhaps in ways that you weren't expecting, or in ways that are challenging in their own right, and you should be paid for those skills in their own right?
Yeah, so I'll just share a little bit about where I'm coming from in this, since I'm sort of the interloper as an independent scholar, but as a high school teacher, who's not currently teaching high school. So I moved to Canada last July with my husband, who's now a professor at the University of Winnipeg here. And previous to that, I'd been a very successful high school teacher in South Carolina and Florida. I was teacher of the year for my county in Florida. I was considered one of the highest impact teachers in Florida as well in terms of test scores. And that, I peaked very early, it felt like, in my career. And then moving to Canada, compared to the United States, just in general, it's very challenging to get teaching jobs here. Like that was true in Toronto where I used to live, and I've been told the same thing here in Winnipeg. And so the reason is partly teachers are well paid, there's good benefits. And so for me coming to that situation from the US, where I had always had the privilege of being able to like choose the job that I want to get it in one interview, and that was it. That's being a public school teacher in the United States a lot of the time. Moving here without a work permit, I also said, okay, I have a year to figure out how I'm going to integrate into the system that seems really uninviting. It's not welcoming in people from outside of the system. And so I've spent this year hustling, I guess, and Erin and I talk a lot about like hustle culture and wanting to get away from that if we can. And so my experience has been a lot of that tension between knowing that you have to hustle if you're going to get to that next stage, and then the little bit of like resistance of like, well, I have been hustling for a long time, and I feel like by now I should be there. I should have made it. I should have this stable career that, for in my case, I had already achieved twice over in different places. So I guess part of it, as Amy was bringing up, is a grappling with identity throughout this period of seeing yourself as first a grad student who is like making these plans and they're ambitious, but you're a go-getter and you're going to get that dream job. And then like, you know, sort of adjusting and figuring things out little by little, that it might not be as simple as that. So one of the things that Amy and I were talking about in our breakout room is the grappling with uncertainty in both of our situations, and trying to figure out how almost moment to moment you can be at peace with that and maintain hope that allows you to continue the hustle that you know you have to do if you're going to get anywhere.
Thank you. Thank you. I find, and maybe this is just my Twitter echo chamber, but I'm so happy to see a reaction against hustle culture that I feel like has come during COVID, and we have time to think about what's important and think about what aspects of our job were actually not necessary or could have been a Zoom meeting, right? For me, it was a big existential issue, like an issue to do with identity, when my hustle was not being rewarded. So I did my undergraduate at Queen's University, and our American scholars will like to hear that we call ourselves the Harvard of the North. So we're exactly that self-important. And it was for students who were high achievers in high school, right? And it was this notion of meritocracy, of working hard, of excellence, like this idea of excellence, but excellence leading to something. And I think that since really 2008, right, when the economy crashed, it's just like, we realize you have to do things for love, but at the same time, that institutions are going to take advantage of your love and your willingness to hustle. But the problem with that is it's not a cause and effect thing. It's not a quid pro quo. And that's a problem. So I have so many examples, innumerable examples, but the one I'll give in this situation is I finished my PhD, which I also did at Queen's. I went away to England for a year to do my master's, and then I came back to Queen's, did my PhD. And then I went away for a year and adjunct taught in Alberta, in rural Alberta. If you think Brandon, Manitoba is rural, Camrose, Alberta is more rural. And so, you know, the things you do as a precarious academic when you're like the most important thing to me is not money, is not building equity or buying property, but is fulfilling my dream and the thing I spent a lot of time and money on, right? And I came back to Queens and I was teaching at Queens, and I went to convocation because having bought my robes, having bought my PhD robes, which is a very expensive investment, I really cared about getting my money's worth. And I love convocations. But I saw my PhD supervisor there, and she wasn't really very much in the department at that point because she was the associate dean of the School of Graduate Studies. So she was actually on stage at convocation, as was I. She had forgotten that I was a colleague at Queens. Like, she couldn't understand why I was there in my robes when I had already graduated the year before. And it's like, because I represent the English department, I am one of the few faculty members from the department who's here to support our students and to be on stage. And like, I was the one taking pictures of my students as they were walking across the stage and emailing them so they could like, give them to their parents, you know? And she forgot. And I was like, this is the person that's writing my reference letters. How do I remind her that, like, not only am I not a student, but I'm literally doing the job so you don't have to? Okay. Let's talk about experiences of invisibility, because this is the thing that just like, it's so humiliating, but I feel like this is a safe space where we can talk about it. Amy, do you have a story of a time that established people who you trusted, or perhaps who are supposed to be mentors, treated you a little bit like you were invisible?
Yeah, it's when you were talking about reference letters, that really struck a chord with me, because after my PhD, my external examiner for my PhD was luckily someone who was well known in the field and someone I respected, and he was willing to write letters for me after I got the PhD, and did for quite some time. And I'm trying to think of when it might have been actually for the third postdoc application. I told him about it through email, asked if he could send a letter, and he didn't respond. And I kind of continued on with my application process and emailed him again, still no response. And so I had to, do that thing where you ask someone else to do it, but suddenly there's not a lot of time and you feel bad about asking this person to do a very quick turnaround. She was happy to do it, thankfully. She's lovely and understood, but I have lost that reference forever. Like, I can no longer ask for this crucial person to support me. And it's not even so much that I'm invisible to him, it's that he became invisible to me, because I once did exist for him. and I no longer, he's just an empty spot now. Which of course I understand. Like, he moved to India and was teaching in India, and there are people who do those things for you. They have lives too, and they have complicated lives. So I never expected it to be, an eternal thing, but it really did make me feel like, those contacts that really do help you hustle, they are ephemeral. And as you sort of age and the years pass, they become even more ephemeral. And I'm at the point now where I feel embarrassed to ask for a reference letter. Like, I expect someone, and no one would, but I expect my references to kind of be thinking, you're still trying this after all this time. And that's my internal critic operating there. But it is like almost an exercise in humiliation to continually ask for things that all of us know are going nowhere. And it is a bit like you're operating in a void where you're doing all this busy work and it just disappears. And, you know, we all know this from job, universities not telling you that you haven't been moved on in the process or anything. It's just poof, it disappears. So I'm very much visible, over visible to myself. I critique myself, think a lot about myself, but everything I create seems to be invisible, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and like those self-esteem issues, we don't want to pass those on to our children or to our students. Like, you don't want to tell your students how little you're getting paid, that you might be getting paid less than their own side hustles, right? Because that's embarrassing for everyone. And so, yeah, this abstinent stack. James, explain.
Sorry, I don't know. It just means that I'd like to speak whenever the next person is finished. That's
Let's hear it.
kind of a way of keeping stack. You know, I don't know.
That must be a Zoom learning thing I didn't learn yet. That's awesome. Thank you. Go ahead.
I don't know. I hate those little yellow hands, but I guess I could have done that too. Anyways, no, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to touch on this point that you made about of telling students how much you make, and the sort of, I think, you know, I mean, I feel like in this panel we're talking a lot about personal experiences, so that's great, and I think that there is this sort of, yeah, this feeling, this shame of like wanting to reveal to your students not only how much you're getting paid, which is awful, right, but also like the precarity of the situation that you're in, like, because we all know that our students look up to us. They think we're like these incredible intellects, you know, like, oh, wow, like they're teaching at a college, you know, and I know I looked at my professors that way. Absolutely. I just so deeply admired, even ones that weren't very good. It was just like a big deal to me that these people were teaching college. But, and so I totally understand that feeling, but at the same time, I don't know, like at CUNY, in my experience, I think maybe this is part of it too, is there was a lot of solidarity. Like, we're a huge university, and so I feel like we were able, and we make up a majority of the faculty, by the way, which is really important. When I say we, I mean when I was an adjunct, adjuncts make up a majority of the faculty, and so there was a lot of commiseration and an enormous amount of activism, and there still is, around this question. And one of the things we always said, and we always did, was that we always spent some time in our classrooms talking about what an adjunct is, like setting aside time to say, I am an adjunct and here's what I get paid, and here's why this is outrageous that you're paying tuition to someone who gets paid so little, and I don't even know if I'm going to be here next semester. You know, and I never have that security, and it makes it very difficult to teach, and you guys should be upset about this. And that was helpful because it certainly got students involved, and it also made the students certainly a lot more sympathetic to you. But it was also, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, cathartic in a way, to just be able to we don't have to pretend to be something we're not, right? If we're being exploited and we're being paid poorly, we should be vocal about that and upset about it. And we are scholars and deserve better. And I don't know how many folks are familiar with Mark Bousquet. We had him come to speak at one of our transitions and transactions conferences, actually. He's a great guy. He wrote a book called How the University Works. And, you know, he talks a lot about this question, since many folks seem here to be talking about graduate student issues as well, and postdoc questions. He writes a lot about this bullshit idea, this idea of that, like, there's an overproduction of PhDs. There's not. There's an underproduction of full-time positions. That's the problem. And so we have great scholars like Amy and Elena and you, Aaron, who should be in full-time positions if they want them. And there's this idea that, oh, well, it's just a market and there's just not enough jobs right now. I just don't think we should buy that. of course, unfortunately, that is the lived experience, but I think politically we have to really push back against that. Yeah, and anyways, I have other thoughts, but yeah, that was just about the question of like talking about how much you earn.
Yeah, no, it's important. It's humiliating, but Amy, when you were talking about how teaching, it just ends up taking up so much of your life. And the thing is, we have integrity. And so we're not getting paid enough to do our jobs to the degree to which we want, but we have too much integrity to do a bad job or to be the prof who doesn't respond to their student, right? Like, I know that person moved to India, but they have the internet in India,
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think when I was teaching at Humber College, and gradually I understood that the student evaluations were what determined how the department viewed you, and your chances of then getting a full-time job depended on those. And that's a whole other issue, evaluations and how inaccurate they can be. But to be the kind of instructor who keeps to the hours of the contract is to not get a good student evaluation, quite frankly. And so not only do we have integrity, and I'd over prepare for lectures. I would try to inspire passion in students who, just in a writing course, in a composition course. So there's all of that, but then also a sense that your future depends on being that heroic teacher who rises above the conditions. And this reminds me of sort of a rhetoric I encountered in K-12 education here in Ontario during COVID, which is, people were saying teachers are heroic, you are heroes for what you are doing. And someone on Twitter a teacher replied, we shouldn't have to be heroes. Like this is not a healthy system for anyone. And as you say, for students, ultimately, teaching conditions are student learning conditions. And I think this is true of healthcare workers too. So this is not limited to the teaching profession, but we shouldn't have to be heroes. And yet every metric they use to evaluate us requires that we be heroic.
Excellent. Thank you. Alina, I know that earlier this year, as you were waiting for all of the visas to come and stuff, you did a lot of voluntary teaching. Can you talk about what it's like to have integrity as a teacher when you're prepping for work that you're ultimately not getting paid for?
Sure. Yeah. So that was part of, I didn't touch on that when I was talking about my year of hustling, but that's basically what I've been doing this year is to the extent that I could, still trying to keep my foot in the water. I don't know if that's a good expression, my toe in there at least in terms of teaching. And it's great to volunteer because it makes you feel good, like you're contributing to society, but it's also a way to get those local references and, feel like that part of your identity is still being served. So it ends up being a very self-serving practice for me. In terms of being a volunteer teacher and trying to not feel exploited, I wouldn't say that that's an issue. I know that I can pull back as much as I need to if something's not working for me. But so some of the areas that I've been volunteering in have been English as an additional language, working with seniors, working in health clinics, anything that I can to kind of maintain a little bit of what I've been doing in the past. But I would say that's largely worked in my favor because I am beginning to get those references that Amy was saying are so important. Amy, what you were saying before, I definitely can relate to in terms of feeling like, I always think of it like, even when I have a full-time job, I can only call my boss so many times. So you got to choose the times really carefully. You don't want to waste any of those moments. And so like in my mind, I have like a hierarchy of references that I can go to. It's like the big job, I got to go for the top reference, but I can only tap into that like 3 times. I have all these imaginary numbers of when I'm going to allow myself to use those. But yeah, I mean, speaking to what you were asking, Erin, I think volunteer work I see is very different from the adjunct world. Like it's hustling, but I don't quite feel like it lacks sometimes the dignity that I feel when I'm being underpaid for something.
No, I think I mean like, are you able to put up boundaries so as to not over prepare for a class when ultimately you're a really good teacher and so you just have the integrity that you feel like you need to prepare? Are you able to say, you know what, I'm not getting paid for this, I'm going to put 1 hour in and no more? Like, about that feeling.
Yeah, okay, I see what you're asking. I wouldn't say it's quite the same as if I were working towards a long-term position at one of these schools. I do over prepare, but I have the privilege of having the time to over prepare. So like in my situation specifically, I generally don't feel like I am spread too thin for what I'm having to do. As a teacher in general, though, I absolutely, when I'm working full time and I feel like every day more and more is being asked of me, that's a more familiar feeling. And certainly, one of the thoughts that I was having as I was preparing for today is that continuous tension between wanting to do a good job and deliver high quality instruction and also impress those decision makers who are going to have a role in your future, and wanting to live a happy life and thinking that at some point you deserve to do that.
Yes, thank you. So one of the issues with precarity is that as academics, as scholars, as humanists, we're supposed to call out inequity and prejudice when we see it. But it is very scary to do that when you are the absolute lowest on the food chain. And I know for me, the fear of precarity I have, it's just like, I don't know, this is a year of recovery for me. Like you don't just turn a switch and suddenly, oh yes, I've jumped up a class. Like I am as if I just, my brain is still there. And yesterday in a departmental meeting about exams, I had to speak out and talk about a colleague using a ton of racial slurs on their exam without like censorship at all, like just and just like after that meeting needing constant reassurance from my partner like every like 10 minutes that ultimately I did the right thing, that this is like my job, and in fact I was like hired because of my pedagogy and my concern for the students and how that would make them feel, right? Like anti-racism not in theory but in like praxis, and I'm still scared, so it doesn't stop, which is a problem. I don't even know. Anyhow, that's still something I'm working on. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
So I was gonna say, like, it sounds like you're still moving through almost the trauma of having been an adjunct, and so your mind is still in that precarious state of something bad's going to happen. I'm catastrophizing this thing. And the reality that your brain almost doesn't hear is that you're good, like you're stable now, you've made it. And I wonder if with time that will grow with, like, do you feel that slowly happening, or does it feel like you're still where you were when you first started this position?
Not where I was, but when we started doing the taxes. So the taxes made my adjunct past present again, because that was still in 2021. It was so emotionally exhausting for me because it brought me back, and having to explain to someone why I worked all those jobs in different provinces, like how I could create this tax issue. But of course, that's teaching during COVID. I'm working on it. I'm working on it. James?
Yeah, I just want to jump in on this question of fear, the fear that precarity creates and the consequences of that. I mean, so obviously, you know, there's consequences for adjuncts individually not wanting, I mean, especially since we're talking about COVID, especially during COVID, not wanting to speak up about things that might be affecting them for fear of being seen as a troublemaker or whatever, and not getting reassigned a class. Yeah, I mean, that's very real. And sometimes it even, like, we're talking about life or death situations here when it comes to things like COVID, right? But it's not only that. You know, I think it also has a much bigger negative effect on I don't know, can I use the word the academy, you know, or the university or higher education as a whole, you know, because the two-tier system is so widespread, because there's so much precarity and so much fear. We have a vast majority of our faculty who are unwilling to exercise faculty self-governance, which is essential for, you know, having institutions that actually work in the interests of students and faculty and research, the things that we're supposed to be doing, not running a business, you know? And so, you know, earlier, Erin, you asked this question about, like, you know, something about who does this affect, right? And I think full-time faculty, adjuncts also and full-time faculty need to make it clear to full-time faculty that this is hurting them as well. You know, the hyper exploitation of adjuncts hurts their positions as well. I know there's this tendency to look at it as like, well, we have our jobs because of the exploitation of adjuncts, and there is some truth to that. You know, that and it's not,
at very least they have their sabbaticals because of adjuncts.
Well, yeah, everyone who teaches should get sabbatical, right? But including adjuncts, you know what I'm saying? But where was I going? I lost my train of thought. I just think it's so important to stress to full-time faculty as well that this harms them as well. And you know, I see this. Also, and in full-time faculty too, you know, there's a lot of fear when you're on the tenure track, for different reasons, because there is so much to lose. I have a close colleague of mine who I organize with a lot, at City University, and we had 2,000 adjuncts fired in 2020. And then in our department, we had hundreds of adjuncts who weren't rehired, right? Which basically means they were fired. And my colleague was at a demonstration. She was interviewed by a newspaper, and she said, yeah, you know, many adjuncts in our department were fired. And our chair came after her and was like, you shouldn't say that. They weren't actually fired. They weren't rehired, et cetera, you know. And she was really scared, and she came to me and was like, should I be worried about this? And, you know, we talked about it, but that fear's there even for, you know, tenure track folks. But I don't know. The only solution to that, again, is solidarity, you know, is finding the other people that are going through the same thing and talking about it and organizing, you know.
Yeah. Amy, I met you through like Renaissance Twitter. In the absence of having current colleagues for that support and solidarity. What role do you think Twitter plays in that for you?
Oh gosh, it's everything right now. It's the only thing quite often. In so many ways, I'm so lucky to have that, and that so many academics, full-time and adjunct, turn to that as a place of community. I think, again, it's doing one of the things that the academy is not doing itself. Like it's offering connections that should be easier to make outside of that. I've met so many amazing Shakespeare scholars, yourself included, and I've had opportunities to, write reviews for Shakespeare journals through, meeting someone on Twitter. And this is something I've noticed too, like during COVID, my sort of academic world has opened up again, weirdly. Like it has been amazing to be able to do online things, to listen into panels and papers, all over the world, when I wouldn't have otherwise had that opportunity. And so I feel like that sort of staying current within the field is much easier right now. The fear is, does that all go away? Like I believe that it's going to continue, the sort of access to online versions of things, but this world seems really intent on going back to normal. And I feel like normal was not healthy. I don't want to go back to what it was. I want a better version of what we are now. And the other thing too about, Twitter and all this sort of online community is that it gets you to a point, but it doesn't do those crucial things you need to do to sort of get your foot in the door. Like, I feel like even, and this goes to what you're talking about with fear, I feel like even full-time tenured professors don't have any power to change the academy. And I hope this is not true, but my sense is like, even if they could speak up, no one would be listening. And so my sense of being able to make to have a way to get into the field in a deeper way through Twitter, it goes to a certain point, and then beyond that, the doors are they still feel closed.
And I find that, like, for us, that Twitter world is the real world. And we talk about it like it's the real,
Yeah.
And then there are people outside that world and they don't know what's going on and they're not part of the discourse. And you're like, wait, don't we all know this? Isn't it this like generally accepted practice? Didn't we resolve on this on Twitter?
Mm-hmm.
Like, not everyone is there. Not everyone is seeing those things happen, right?
Yeah.
And
it does. You sometimes feel like you're living in two different universes too, and the people who are keyed into that and the people who aren't, and it's again creating that sense of a bit of isolation, or that worlds can't overlap when it's almost like you're speaking a different language.
Very much so. Okay, let's turn our thoughts to this notion of back to normal. Alina, what's one part, whether it's teaching or employment with to do with teaching or anything, or hustle culture, anything like that, what should we not bring with us when we go back to normal? What has COVID taught us about the way we need to treat living or working or teaching?
That's a great question. What should we not bring with us as we go back to normal? I think, Amy, you were starting to talk about this a little bit. What should we not bring with us? So the things that I'm not in favor of that have developed over this time, I think that
cultural things, cultural things in teaching and learning and stuff like that, that you're like, well, now that we've seen that things can be more accessible in this way, should we really go back to making them less accessible?
Oh, I see. So the before times. I was thinking of like, what are the things that have developed that I feel like we need to avoid doing? I'll speak to that, and then I'll see if I can circle back around to what you're asking. So I think with COVID, the way that I think about the teaching in general is that teaching can have a limitless container, or it can be, it can fill whatever space you allow it to fill. So you can be working, I think you can probably work literally 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and still feel like you have things you could be doing to get better and better. And that with COVID and pandemic teaching, that has gotten really murky and really blurry where that container should be. So you can say, and maybe before you said, I went to my job and I worked there, and then I kind of like turned things off. And more and more now I talk to teachers who are like getting emails from students on a Saturday saying like, hey, can we meet right now? And because you're accessible in a different kind of way because of Zoom practices, there's this more of an expectation that you're going to be on call more than you would be if you were in a brick and mortar situation. But going back to the before times, yeah, I mean, there's the obvious ones of let's make sure that we do use this form of communication whenever we can, because we actually have opportunities to connect with people that we wouldn't see otherwise. Like, this really is an amazing thing to be able to have this Canada, like United States connection. So bringing that forward into the classroom, I think, is essential. Like, so many times I've had the opportunity in class to bring a speaker in now that, like, through Skype, through Zoom, that would not have even occurred to me to do that before. So I guess using technology to connect as much as possible is what I'd want to bring along for the ride.
Amy, and then James and Jacob, what things from the before times should we not bring back?
I'm trying to think of, well, I don't know if universities or colleges can get rid of this, but I'm trying to think of ways to orient education, higher education, not around learning out, like at Humber, the big term was learning outcomes. And so every syllabus would have, these are the things you are going to learn, tangible things. And that's good, but I think it burned away a lot of the sort of, I don't even know, like the intangibles of education, so that it's more product focused and outcome driven than a sense of, just nurturing minds. And maybe this leads into the rhetoric of, institutions being accused of, teaching socialism or communism or, yeah. And so that has been demonized, that sense of sort of humanistic learning has been demonized. And in the sort of the business side of it, the gig economy side of it has been overemphasized. And I think that was happening before COVID hit. So I don't want to bring that forward. I want to also stop the discourse that students are being given a product with teaching and that they pay this amount of tuition, they deserve this kind of teaching, which I think COVID made much worse, because there were complaints about online teaching in K-12 even, that the teachers weren't teaching during COVID when they were actually teaching online. And if you've taught online like we have, then it's 10 times harder to teach online. But they're sort of not willing to see that. And I think there's also, especially in Ontario, K-12 and probably in the higher education too, is a sort of demonization of teachers and for political ends. And I want I want to sort of, I want universities to emerge from that sort of psychosis and see academic learning as a meeting of minds rather than a product-based delivery system.
Yeah, for sure. This was a big issue that came up during our faculty strike because our university teach, dental school, med school, rehab science, public health, nursing, all of those things are just so important during COVID. And for Jacob and James, both Ontario and Manitoba both have very conservative provincial governments, in the same vein as the whole of the Trump stuff, just like a willingness to lie, an idea that earning money is the most important, these ideas of outcomes, right? As opposed to intangibles. And this big issue is that they kept talking about training nurses, training. It's like, we're teaching. And that's different. Yeah. James and Jacob.
I don't know if I have a lot more to add. I mean, I really agree with a lot of what Amy said about, the ways in which education is being treated more and more like a product, and universities run more and more like a business. And I am worried, of course, that, and we talked about this a lot as a faculty when we were moving to online, was that we were like, okay, this is absolutely needed. It's for the best because it's going to be safe and it's going to save lives, and we absolutely should do this and embrace it. But a lot of us, I would say most of us, also said, but this can't become like a substitute for in-class teaching. And we know, I don't know what your universities are like, but because, it's different. Like at a liberal arts college, they have a certain business model and image they're trying to present, so they don't want to go too online. But the big universities like the City University of New York would love to have even more adjuncts that they don't even have to give offices to or buy computers for, and just, work from home, and we'll pay you even less because, hey, you don't have to commute, and that really scares me. What?
Oh, that was one of the things we striked about. It wasn't just for wages, for recruitment and retention. It was also the ability to say no to online teaching once COVID was over. But it was this weird thing because we were also like, but we can't go back to classes we can't go back to in-person in January because Omicron is ravaging the province. But we also want to be able to say no to online teaching once it's over, because pedagogically it's insufficient. I'm not going to say it's not working, because for some students it's fantastic, but it's not sufficient. Jacob.
Well, a thing I've come to recognize over the past couple of years, especially during COVID, is our students also don't want to be plugged into this model of there's a product or a business transaction that's occurring here, that the vast majority of our students want, like that in the US, at least, we've had there's a nationwide drop in enrollment, as we all know. And partly that's driven by the fact that a lot of students would prefer to be meeting in person have the quote unquote classic college lifestyle. That doesn't just mean frat or sorority parties. That doesn't mean just hanging out in the quad. That means the actual college experience of having professors turn you on to new ideas that you hadn't heard before, which is part of that whole striking out, being independent and forming your own adult identity and stuff. And I'm not trying to be cheesy or sentimental here. It's a reminder that if we're from a labor level, if we're going to be making any sorts of changes or pressures on the administration, we need as many as we can get. And our students are our allies. They are the ones who will also join in pressuring administration, because if administration insists on running the college like a business, get the paying customers to complain, speak in the language that they speak. And just the reason students don't like, by and large, don't like online learning is because there's no sense of human community. Just on a basic level, they all, even in their STEM classes, they desire that feeling of chatting with professors and learning new things and working through new processes. And our students are our biggest allies in pressuring administration. So I guess I'm thinking on both an idealistic level, but also on a very pragmatic nuts and bolts level. We're not the only ones who want this. Our students want this, and we should be talking about these issues with our students, and we should be inviting them to join us on these issues. And they don't want to be treated like cogs in the machine. My goodness, there's one demographic in America that doesn't like to be treated like a cog in the machine. It's 18-year-olds, college students, right? That's like half of all pop music, for crying out loud. So it's, I don't know, I'm kind of just rambling and free associating here, but even before COVID, when I was an adjunct and a graduate instructor at Iowa, getting involved in these labor issues, I just always found it was my students were my most sympathetic ear and the ones who were most willing to get involved when I invited them, despite even their own busy schedules. And
our students did an amazing social media campaign during the strike. Like, they made memes, they made songs, they created the signs and stuff. Like, they're so talented and they know how to express themselves, which is so special. So the way I'm going to wrap this up is to say, come back this afternoon when I will be talking about how I used A Christmas Carol to work through these major labor issues from the strike, as a way of making meaning after the strike, as a way of both apologizing and not apologizing for standing up for our rights and just decimating their Christmas vacation. Okay, thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate you taking your time on a Saturday morning. Alina and Amy, thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I know it can be, we all know it can be very vulnerable and raw, and I just really appreciate it. So applause to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin, for putting this together and for inviting us to be here. It was such an important conversation. I'm so grateful to be a part of it, and for our people, Jacob and James, listening in too and giving your thoughts as well.